begin this evening's program, I would just like to remind you to please turn off any cell phones or other electronic devices that do make noises. Also, following Mr. Garrett's remarks, we'll have a brief question and answer period. During that period, if you would like to ask a question, please line up at the microphone at either side of the auditorium and clearly speak into the mic. Tonight, I am more than honored to introduce CBS Chief White House Correspondent, Major Garrett. Garrett has held this position since November of 2012 and has covered exclusive events such as President Obama's first trip to the Middle East in his second term of office, as well as the fiscal cliff controversy. In addition to his work at CBS, he's also currently the correspondent at large at the National Journal and has worked for other major news networks such as Fox News and CNN. Major Garrett is an alumnus of the University of Missouri with degrees in journalism and political science. In his presentation tonight, Major Garrett will be discussing the importance of this autumn for President Obama's presidency. From difficult foreign relations in the Middle East, as well as the congressional deadlock concerning the raising of the debt ceiling that we all have seen unfold, Garrett will discuss the proposed policy implications and their effect on the presidency. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Major Garrett.
Yeah, everyone turned their BlackBerries off. Wait a minute. Probably hardly anyone still has a BlackBerry, right? Except me, because this will be a kind of a free-flowing news environment because so many things are happening right now in Washington. I was just sitting back there. Speaker Boehner just came to the microphones outside the White House to talk after talking with the president and the majority leader and the minority leader of the House and the minority leader of the Republicans in the Senate. The president may come to the briefing room in the next 10 minutes. So I'm going to kind of condense my original presentation, and we're going to have a lot of time for questions and answers because I think, based on my experience, having covered these sorts of events before and having traveled extensively in the last 3 or 4 years around the country, moments like this, people really are craving some common sense answers, and I think I can give you many, or at least I can give you insights into what's going on. Because I think a lot of Americans are justifiably, A, concerned, bordering on frightened, and deeply frustrated and aggravated by what they see not happening. And they'd like some explanation, if an explanation is achievable, about why this is going on. I don't promise you a full explanation of what's going on, but I promise you at least a description of the forces I see coming to bear and maybe some of the underlying causes of the motivations behind those forces. So first of all, because I mentioned it and my BlackBerry is still working, I'm really going to be one of those people that they're going to pry the BlackBerry literally out of my fingers before I give it up. I have an iPhone personally, but I love the BlackBerry as an email device. Okay, Speaker Boehner just came literally to the microphones about 5 minutes ago. There is no breakthrough. There is no prospect for a breakthrough. The Speaker said he is demanding of the President a conversation and negotiations about the future of the health care law, of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. Said the President rejected that, and so did Senate Democrats. The Speaker said it's time for the President to respect the negotiating process that our founders laid before the country, and until they do, we're going to be at this impasse. So, that's the Speaker. No deal, no prospect of a deal, no negotiations. If the President comes to the briefing room, I predict what he will say, because I've heard him say it the last 5 or 6 days, which is this: the President's health care law is settled law. It was passed by Congress. It was signed by him. It was challenged before the Supreme Court. It was upheld, and there was a re-election campaign in which it was a significant issue, and he won. That's 3 wins for a president and 0 wins for the detractors. Presidents don't hand over power to detractors after 3 consecutive victories. Not just as a matter of the fact that he loves the law, worked hard to put it into effect, and is implementing it now, but for every future president, if you establish a precedent like that, you weaken the presidency institutionally. No president is in favor of that. No Republican president is in favor of that. No Democratic president is in favor of that. And this is all about keeping the government operating. We haven't even gotten to the debt ceiling issue. The president won't negotiate there as well. Now, that's his current rhetorical posture, And I think once we get closer to October 17th, and that's the date where the Treasury Department has said borrowing authority essentially expires, and technically the United States lapses into default. Now, I'll go into a little bit of the weeds on that in a second, but the President said, I'm not going to negotiate over that. Well, the fact of the matter is he's negotiated over the debt ceiling twice already in his presidency. He wishes he hadn't, but that precedent exists and Republicans know it. And so what you may see in the next couple of weeks is some very nimble rhetorical sidestepping of the concept of negotiation, what is or isn't a negotiation, and how the President can get out of this. Now, let me just give you a couple of background notes for yourself on the question of default and when it could happen and what the most important dates are. First of all, October 17th is when the Treasury Department said we've technically defaulted. But because the government is shut down, what's happening? We're spending less money. When you spend less money, you accumulate debt less rapidly. So probably November 1st is going to be the actual witching hour, because a couple of things happen on November 1st. It's probably 2 weeks, if the shutdown lasts 2 weeks, and my betting is right now it will. Then you'll have 2 weeks of accumulated non-spending that will give a little bit more of a buffer. But also on November 1st, the Treasury has due obligations owed to trust funds related to Social Security and Medicare, and payouts there that have to be made, and they're large, not surprisingly. So November 1st, you'll hear a lot about October 17th, but for your own internal purposes, if you have a day planner or a calendar and you want to circle the date of Armageddon, well, I would recommend November 1st as opposed to October 17th. I know that's so very comforting. That's kind of a technical analysis of the way the debt ceiling will approach and the amount of time. The only reason I really think that's relevant is that this may give lawmakers and the President a bit more time. They may treat October 17th as a real deadline, come up against it and say, you know what, we have a little bit more room. They're going to have to find room. Now, I'm not a historian, I'm not a political scientist by trade. I have a bachelor's in political science and a bachelor's in journalism. But I've covered legislative politics off and on since 1990 when I first arrived in Washington. And I'm a little bit bemused when the Speaker says the President needs to respect the history of the Founding Fathers and the process the Founding Fathers laid before us. Trust me, I know the process the Founding Fathers laid before us. I've watched it operate, and I've watched it not operate. I've spent a lot more time watching it not operate in the last 5 years as compared to the first 15 years I covered Washington, where I actually watched it operate. And for the Speaker to say the President needs to respect that seems a bit odd to me, because one of the things that is a constitutional responsibility of the House of Representatives is to pass spending bills, all the spending bills. Now, earlier this year, the House of Representatives, controlled by Republicans, passed a budget resolution, which is just a framework document. The President never signs it. It doesn't have force of law, but it's a framework. It's a blueprint for how you want to spend. And the bills Republicans like to pass, veterans, military construction, things like that, they've all passed in accordance with their budget resolution. 4 of the 13. The other 9 they can't pass, even with their own majority, because it's too politically difficult to live up to the budget they themselves drafted. So there is a huge inconsistency here when Republicans in the House say, regular order, we've got to pass all these things, respect the constitutional appropriations process, and they don't have a process at all. One of the reasons we're in the shutdown situation is between the two bodies, the House and the Senate, the House has passed 4 spending bills. Of the 13, the Senate has passed 0. Okay? But when you don't pass any bills on what we're spending, you find yourself in a shutdown scenario because there's no existing bill to even go from. If your legislature operated that way, New Hampshire would also shut down. So would Ohio, so would California. Matter of fact, my home state of California has done that many times. They can't get a budget and they go into a shutdown scenario. So Congress isn't doing its basic job on a day-to-day basis. Why? Because the politics are too difficult. Okay. Difficult politics require larger-than-life answers. And what we have seen are sort of smaller-than-life responses to these larger-than-life political pressures. That's one of the reasons we're in the situation we're in. Now, why has Obamacare become the central turf on which Republicans want to fight? It was passed in a partisan matter. Not a single Republican voted for it. There were some procedural mechanisms Democrats used when they ran the Senate and had a large majority there in the House. The Republicans are still bruised about. They think the law is bad. Philosophically, they're opposed to it. But there is also something deeper, and I think it is at least partially an explanation for their entrenched refusal to give in on this question. And it goes to a question of the application of presidential power. Republicans in the House particularly, but with some very notable examples in the Senate, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, have a very big problem with the president selectively using executive authority in the application of federal laws. For example, right now in immigration law, there are some Americans who violate immigration law who are deported, some who are not, some who qualify for the same deportation but are not deported. They're the so-called dreamers, because the president has said, I'm going to use executive discretion to not deport them. Because Congress didn't pass the DREAM Act, I'm sick and tired of waiting for them, so I'm going to use the discretion I have as chief executive to not apply this certain part of the law. That aggravates Republicans as an application of federal power, or they would argue a misapplication of federal power. They look at the president's health care law and say, well, you've offered lots of waivers to either labor unions or businesses or others who have grievances or can't quite get up to speed on complying with the law, and those waivers are your executive power about a piece of legislation that Congress passed. Congress ought to have a voice in that waiver process. You are overreaching your executive power. Now, I raise that because I think it's one possible route of compromise, ultimately. I think one thing Republicans would like to talk to the president about in relation to the health care law is, all right, if you're not going to rewrite it, how about you legislatively enact the waivers you've granted through executive power? Give Congress the say to do the things you've already done, but just make us a player in that. Now, that's a can of worms for the president because he knows he would have to negotiate those with a House Republican very much opposed to the health care law. But he might be comfortable with that. That could be a way out if the two sides want to find a way out. And in a couple of weeks, they're going to have to find a way out. But I think that is one explanation underlying all the sort of political theatrics of why Republicans have decided that the health care law is a place to wage this fight. Now, there are other institutional pressures as well. I still work for National Journal. I write a column every week. And National Journal in 1982 started something that it does every year. And in the New Hampshire primary process, you oftentimes hear this come up, the National Journal vote ratings. Who falls where on the spectrum of conservative and liberal? You may remember in 2008, it was often cited that Barack Obama was the most liberal senator. Well, that came from our National Journal vote study of where you voted and how it lined up against everyone else in the body in which you participate, the Senate or the House. So let me give you two statistics that I think might help you understand the transformation of American politics since National Journal first started that in 1982. In 1982, the survey revealed the following, that there were 57 senators in what National Journal then called the broad middle, meaning they were in between the most liberal Republican, who at the time was someone you may remember, Lowell Weicker from Connecticut, and Ed Zirinsky, a Democrat from Nebraska. So you took their voting records, the most conservative Democrat over here, the most liberal Republican over here. There were 57 senators whose voting records fell in between those two poles. That's 1982. In 2010, 2011, and 2012, there were precisely 0, who fell in between the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican. 0. In 1982, there were 357 members of the House who fell in between that spectrum. Claudine Schneider, someone you also may remember, Rhode Island Republican, was the most liberal Republican, and Glenn Johnson, I think, from Georgia, was the most conservative Democrat. But anyway, 357 fell in between that spectrum. In 2010, the number was 7. In 2012, it rose all the way to 12. Okay, so what you have in those years is this relentless sorting out and pulling out of people who occupied what could be fairly described as a genuine middle ground in American politics, and a relentless sorting of those participants into straight partisan camps, year by year by year. It didn't go from 57 to nothing. It went, as you might expect, 57 to 54 to 45 to 40, and it shrank, and this relentless sorting occurred. That's an institutional pattern that has not changed, and the direction, the trajectory of that sorting has not changed. And now we're at a point where it simply can't change. I mean, how do you go past 0? You can't go past, it can't be -1. I mean, we're at the absolute minimum in the Senate. You can't go any lower. And in the House, 7 or 12 out of 435, are you kidding? So that, when you have that kind of sorting and that kind of division, I heard the word, exactly, and almost ritualistic partisan alignment, it's harder to reach compromise. And let me give you another structural bit of analysis that I think can help you understand what's happened in American politics in the last 12 to 16 years. The biggest transformation I ever covered in Congress was 1994, when after 40 years, House Republicans won control of the House. And the Senate was also controlled by Republicans in that same election. Now, they'd had it briefly for 6 years, during the first 6 years of the Reagan presidency, from 81 to 87, effectively 80 to 86, but lost it again. So this was the first time Republicans controlled both chambers of Congress since Harry Truman. That was a huge, huge change. And how did Republicans win it? By never agreeing. By forcibly creating the strongest, most stark ideological contrast they could with the governing party. Republicans held it until 2006. And how did Democrats win it back? By relentlessly pursuing contrast of the hardest, sharpest edge imaginable. The greatest ideological difference they could communicate to the country about what they were for and what Republicans were for, and to pick and choose. So how did Republicans win it in 94? By giving no ground and saying they would give no ground. How did Democrats win it back? By giving no ground and saying they would give no ground. House Republicans won it back in 2010, promising to do what? Give no ground. All right? So for every political actor, Republican or Democrat, male or female, these experiences are become part of your own operating mentality. If giving no ground helps you win, what are you incentivized to do? Give no ground. And what happens when you do find a compromise? Like, for example, under crisis scenarios, TARP. What happens? You save the country, you think. The Treasury Secretary, all the Wall Street people who are in panic, the World Bank, the IMF is coming up saying, if you don't do this, the entire world economy could collapse. On a bipartisan basis, you all hold hands and jump off the cliff. And for the next 6 years, what do you have ringing in your ear every time you have a town meeting, like a drill bit? TARP, TARP, TARP. Why did you do that? Why did you do that? I compromised. I did what I thought was right for the country. And what are the incentives you get back? You are lame. You are toady to Wall Street. You used all our money and bailed out the fat cats and didn't help Main Street. So when you do reach into the breach and you hold hands and you make a tough decision, what are the incentives you get in your districts or in your state sometimes? To do just the opposite, to fight harder, because compromise doesn't sit well. Why does compromise not sit well? Because just as Congress has been sorting itself out ideologically, so has the country. I mean, you can't have that ideological sorting in Congress if it's not occurring in states and congressional districts. So as the country is more ideological, more divided, more partisan, the incentives they send to those who represent them are equally at odds with compromise. Compromise doesn't satisfy either side. And if you're in the political world, you want to satisfy somebody, usually the people you need to re-elect you. So these incentive patterns have changed. And whenever I say this at a speech, inevitably the question comes, well, what's going to change these incentive patterns? I wish I could tell you. Voting patterns may change, but voters are routinely told, well, you need to send a different signal. But Democrats are entrenched right now, as are Republicans. Those who are active in American politics really care about the things they care about. Democrats want to keep the Affordable Care Act and don't want to listen to anyone who wants to undercut it or undermine it. Republicans equally passionately want to get rid of the Affordable Care Act and don't want to talk to or listen to anyone who wants to keep it. Well, that doesn't really leave a lot of room for agreement. And so what happens is these incentives to remain divided remain until what? there is an external event that pressurizes, that forces people, because of the commotion caused by the debt ceiling, the fiscal cliff, whatever it is, a shutdown scenario. I mean, the president routinely, and I understand it, institutionally, he's kind of sick and tired of government by crisis. But if the normality of government is division, incentivized division, and relentless partisan sorting, what is the only thing that changes that dynamic? A crisis, an external pressurizing event. And that's what we're living through right now. Until we reach a different sense of our own destiny as a nation, our own application of politics, our own sense of compromise, this is going to remain. And so I know it's frustrating, I know it's aggravating, and I'm not saying that any of this to excuse the lawmakers who are participating in it, but I do think there is a historical backdrop, and I do think that there are aspects of American politics that at least partially explain this behavior. Two last points before I open it up for questions. One, Ted Cruz, when he ran as a Republican in the primary in Texas for the United States Senate, ran commercials against David Dewhurst, the leading establishment Republican there, and his chief complaint against David Dewhurst had nothing to do with ethics, had nothing to do with his record on policy, had nothing to do with his age or anything else. He had one crystallizing issue against David Dewhurst, the establishment Republican. He had a history of compromising. He had a history of agreeing with some Democrats in Texas. Now look, a Texas Democrat is like a raging Republican in half the rest of the country, you know? But because David Dewhurst, from Ted Cruz's point of view and political motivations, that made him, by definition, unacceptable to Republican primary voters. And that's precisely what happened. So why would anyone expect Ted Cruz's behavior in Washington to come within 100 miles, or as they would say in Texas, a country mile, of compromise? It just won't happen. He has no incentive. As a matter of fact, every incentive he has is exactly the opposite. Why? Because he ran as a permanent, implacable foe of compromise. And that's how he won. Last point. I'm scheduled to leave with the President in the press charter. The President will fly a few hours later to Asia. Midnight, I'm supposed to leave. The President will leave midday Saturday. This was supposed to be a 7-day trip to Indonesia for what's called the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, and then to Brunei for ASEAN, which is a security foreign policy meeting of all the significant Asian nations. Now, the President's going to make that trip because he knows if he doesn't show up, China will say to all the countries, friends of ours and those who would like to be friends of ours, where's America? They're not here. All that stuff about the President says about making a big play in the Pacific Rim, Asia, that doesn't mean it. He doesn't have the power. His government's divided, and he's not even here. The President can't afford that. They're trying to negotiate this large trans-Pacific trade partnership, trying to make sure that South Korea knows we've got their back with North Korea, that Japan knows that we're a reliable security and economic ally, that other potential allies in the region know we're there. Now that trip is in jeopardy because of the shutdown. The President is having to make all sorts of executive designations of the advanced staff, the government employees who need to be on the ground for this trip just to make it happen, to preserve America's ability to communicate and literally fly the flag of America in the most important region in the world for the next century. People might think it's the Middle East. There are plenty of things in the Middle East that are problematic. But I think as the last 6 months have shown, we are at the margins influential in the Middle East. Many of these things and the combustibility there will play out largely at a grassroots level and in directions, as in Egypt, we have very little ability to control. But Asia, we do have a role. And this President, I think wisely, as every President before him, has figured out Asia is a huge place and we need to be there. This shutdown jeopardizes the very ability of the United States to communicate on a world stage to friend and foe alike. That seems to me to be a significant issue. And I know the President is infuriated that he had to already cancel Malaysia and Indonesia because he can't make an executive designation that those two trips are vital. He can for these other two because there's a huge economic and national security summit. So those have already been canceled. Malaysia and Philippines, gone. But you don't think the Chinese are already on the phone saying, hey, where's America? Now, you may not think Malaysia is important to us. It may not be right now. 10 years from now, we might need it. It might be important. The Philippines will always be important, geographically and economically. We're not there. I think these shutdowns have enormous consequences, not just here, but on the world stage. And for that reason, in addition to everything the Americans already know about the shutdown's effects here, I think it has practical effects and memorable effects overseas, and we'll see them starting next week. I went on a little bit longer than I thought I would, but anyway, go to the microphones. Please bring me your questions. You're a wonderful audience, and let me check my BlackBerry, because the President may have come to the briefing room in the intervening 5 minutes. Oh, President won't come to the briefing room tonight, so there we go. All right, so head to the mics. Bring me, or just ask from the floor. I've got pretty good ears. Hi.
Hi. I'd like to hear your comment on a couple more points about your analysis on American politics, because I think one of the reasons why Republicans and others are staying entrenched is not so much because they ran on a policy of entrenchment, but because they're being challenged by outside forces in their districts, whether those are the organized Tea Party, which is sending money and contributions from outside districts into their districts and thereby forcing them to remain entrenched because of primary challenges or the threat of primary challenges. The other thing is that Democrats, in defending the Affordable Care Act, are of course defending the Republican health care plan from the 90s. From the 90s, yeah. Right. So, you know, a lot of liberal Democrats would probably prefer a single-payer system. Oh, absolutely. So I think the whole thing where, you know, if Democrats are entrenched, they're entrenched much more to the right than they were, or they would have been if it hadn't been for that. So, I mean, I think the whole thing has shifted to the right as well, and that's another factor to take into account.
Let me take your second point. I'll get to your first point, but let me take your second point first, because I think it's really, really important. I found it fascinating during the fiscal cliff resolution that the President of the United States, after winning re-election, promising the country that he would raise taxes on every American who made more than $250,000, settled at a figure of $400,000. And almost every Democrat in Congress agreed with him that there should be no tax increase for an American who made up to $399,999 a year in adjusted gross income. That's a pretty amazing thing. That would not have been the Democratic Party position when I was here in 1992 covering my first presidential primary. Bill Clinton wouldn't have endorsed that. Paul Tsongas wouldn't have endorsed that. Bob Kerrey wouldn't have. And sure as hell, Tom Harkin wouldn't have endorsed that. Okay? Nor 96 or 2000 or 2004. But the resolution after re-election is $400,000. That's the new, you cannot tax an American on the income tax level any higher beneath that figure. $150,000 higher than the president campaigned on and won. And what I wrote at the time was Republicans don't know how to push against an open door. I mean, $400,000, are you kidding me? When the contract with America was presented, when Republicans were campaigning in 1994, they had two significant tax cuts. One was the marriage penalty relief, and one was capital gains. Modest in both respects. John Kerry, every Democrat called them a huge, outrageous tax gift to the wealthy. Marriage penalty relief, adoption tax credit, capital gains. I show up in Iowa in 2004, John Kerry cuts a commercial extolling those tax cuts. And that's how he beats, that's how he does really well in Iowa, okay? So you're right, there have been movements in American politics since then that are more to the right than perhaps absolute liberal Democrats would prefer. I know 400,000 was not something that most liberal Democrats thought would be the bottom line. And the individual mandate, you're correct, started the Heritage Foundation in the early 90s as an application of the way to pull people into the insurance pools to broaden risk and lower costs. Not single payer. Absolutely. Liberal Democrats would. Howard Dean was here last week, was he not? I know Howard Dean. I covered his campaign as well. He would argue on all sorts of policy, not just politics, but policy matters, that single payer is better. Didn't get it. So you're right, there has been this push. And when you have the President of the United States, theoretically a liberal, saying 400,000 is the threshold, that's kind of a Republican victory. In this shutdown scenario, the Democrats in the White House have endorsed for 2 months a spending number that is in line with a second year of sequestration. They've swallowed this Republican spending number, much lower than they would prefer, by a factor of like 35 or $40 billion, which is a not insignificant amount in one fiscal year. They're telling Republicans, we'll take your number. again, the door is open. They don't know how to push on it because of this obsession, as the president says, and certainly all their behavior indicates it, about the health care law. Now, your first point about primaries, that is a different thing. Now, whether the pressure comes from external, like I imagine you're thinking of Club for Growth or Americans for Prosperity or groups like that, that's true. And, or Heritage Action, which is the political wing now of the Heritage Foundation on the conservative side, those do make a difference. And in ways that were simply not true 6 years ago. The fear of a Republican primary is much more on the minds of Republicans, particularly in the House, not so much in the Senate, but in the House, than it was before. And that pressure does intensify their desire to stay completely consistent with what they said they were going to do or what they fear they will be held responsible for doing if they compromise. So you're right about that. Over here.
First of all, welcome back to New Hampshire. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
I'd just like to get some feedback on how you feel, looking at your career, looking at the firms, the people that you worked for, which I would say on both sides of the aisle.
Yes.
There's a perception in America that America is very liberal, and the news media is very biased towards the president. You can look back over when President Bush, you know, whatever he would have done would have been covered in the news, and whatever Barack Obama does is not covered in the news.
Right.
So I just like to get your feel for that, because I think a lot of us are maybe news junkies or into politics. And, you know, what happened to Walter Cronkite? And what happened to the days where, you know, I still watch the evening news every night. I may be one of the 11% of the population that does that.
And I thank you very much.
And I probably watch too much news, and sometimes it's very depressing. But I'm very, very concerned. And I understand the entertainment aspect of some of the shows. But we in this country always look towards the media, whether it was print or broadcast, to kind of give us an unbiased, as a human being can be. And I'd just like to get your opinion of that. I think that would be very valuable. Thank you.
It's a big question, and I'll try to keep my answers short because I want to make sure I get to everybody. Just so everyone here knows, I think this gentleman probably has some familiarity with my background, but you heard I work for CNN, I work for Fox, and I work for CBS. I also covered Capitol Hill for several years for the Washington Times. I'm probably the only person who will ever appear before you who has written a cover story for Mother Jones and the Weekly Standard. Okay? So, and I've written 3 books. The first 2 I co-authored with a former Democratic member of the House, Tim Penny from Minnesota. So I have a sort of wide-ranging and you might describe eclectic relationship to the media. I'm not a person who has occupied any turf. All I want to do is be a reporter. And all I want to do is sort things out the best I can on every day that I have the issues before me and the facts before me, and then try to communicate, as I'm doing tonight, I hope, as clearly and succinctly what's happening and let you figure out what you want to think about it. I have no interest in telling you what to think. I only have an interest in informing you. And I'm very happy that CBS has put me in a position of prominence to be their chief White House correspondent, because in that role I think I have some ability to carry out that mission of my job. And I've also been lucky enough to be the substitute host for Bob Schieffer on Face the Nation. So that's another place where I can ask questions, sort things out, and let people figure out what they want to decide. Now, I only speak for myself when I answer this question, because I can't speak for the larger media complex. All I can say is I've succeeded in my career doing this one thing, and when I have the good fortune of being able to meet folks like you, I frequently hear that people respond positively because they sense that about me when they watch me or when they read me. So in my own way, and this is a kind of a self-indulgent answer in part to your question, I do try to stand as one example to my colleagues of how you can do it and how you can succeed and how you can not find yourself captive to these larger tectonic forces in the media, which on cable certainly, and even on the web now, tend to reinforce a partisan perspective on underlying facts. And the one thing I would say about the increased number of cable stations, certainly the vast increase in websites. I mean, quick story. When I came up here in 1992, the greatest technological innovation known to presidential campaign was a VHS tape. Those of you remember, Bill Clinton was in a lot of trouble up here. 3 big issues: Jennifer Flowers, did you inhale, and did you dodge the draft? Okay? And what was his technological innovation? What was his shattering technological innovation. You had people come up on buses from Arkansas with little plastic bags inside which was placed a VHS tape about his history in Hope, Arkansas. And they put it on doorknobs. Okay? That was the shattering technological breakthrough of 1992. I mean, it seems quaint and almost like Egyptian or something, like out of a tomb. Okay? As we now have every form of communication imaginable, and some in 5 years will be unimaginable. I remember in 2008 covering the Obama campaign, and they were really adept, much more so than anybody else, about having people put in their cell phones. Many of them were flip phones, so quaint to think about the flip phone in 2008, the text number so they could text you little updates on the Obama campaign. Remember, that's how Joe Biden was announced as the running mate, via text on a flip phone. Oh, it's so cute. All these things have created more communication, more outlets, more voices, but also much more contention, because the way you find yourself, clicks on the web, or viewers or eyeballs in the cable world, is to not have this sort of quiet, stentorian, reserved explication of the facts, but you have something that resembles a shouting session, or at least a place where there is built-in contention, that contention itself is the product, not news or facts or analysis that has any sense of dispassionate origins. I can't control that. I can't stop that. Look, I worked for Fox, who sort of created that in the primetime hours. And what I did during the non-primetime hours was be this dispassionate arbiter of the facts as I knew them. And I was promoted 4 times at Fox and became their most visible editorial presence. You know, so I did my thing. Fox did its thing. We benefited for 8 years, and then I went back to my life as a writer. And then CBS came along with this job, and I took it. The other thing I would say about the media, and I think this doesn't really go to your question about liberal, or does the president get a break? Did George Bush get beat up on? I know that's a deep, embedded perception. And I know the kinds of stories, because I hear about it from people who used to work in the Bush White House all the time. Well, if we did this, you can't imagine what the press coverage would be. Well, yeah, probably I can. And why does it seem different? Well, people remember things differently. People have different perceptions. Part of that is filtered through their own partisan sense. If you don't like somebody and someone's not as tough as you are, you don't feel they're tough enough. And if you like somebody and someone's tough, you feel like they're being too tough because you like them. You know, so those perceptions and that partisan division in our country tends to color a little bit of the way we perceive the media. And the other thing is, look, when it was Walter Cronkite and David Brinkley and John Chancellor, that was it. 3. And your morning newspaper. And if you were lucky enough, your afternoon newspaper. That was it. Okay, you didn't have 3 cables and 3 business channels slicing and dicing everything across the spectrum for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And if you look at all the cables now, more and more of those 24-hour news channels don't actually broadcast news. They broadcast commentary about the news. I mean, basically the 24-hour news spectrum, all 3, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, are down to about 6 hours a day of actual news, maybe less. You know, there are a lot of personality-driven shows. So 6 out of 24 or 4 out of 24, that shows you what actually sells and gets a certain amount of ratings in the cable world. And the attention span of the country is differently. I used to tell people at Fox, the youngsters who would complain about Brit Hume, who was a great boss, someone who has a long history here in New Hampshire. They're like, oh, Brit Hume, he doesn't know anything. He's an old doddering old fool. I'm like, hey, first of all, none of that's true. And second of all, slow your roll, because when Brit Hume covered the White House for ABC as the chief White House correspondent, 19 million Americans watched him. 19 million people watched each of the network broadcasts. At CBS, we're very happy we get 6 million. Now, that's 19 million in a country of about 220 million, as compared to 6.5 million at CBS now in a country of 320. Our authority as a network is diminishing because fewer and fewer people are watching the evening news at 6:30. It's not the blue glowing campfire it used to be. When I grew up and watched Walter Cronkite, it was the blue glowing campfire. We all warmed our hands around the campfire of news at 6:30. We don't do that anymore. You know, ask anyone in the web industry, when are the times people read the web? When they go to work, 9 to 10. Optimal time to read the web. And then they take a break, they actually do some work, and then they go to lunch, and then 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. They read the web a lot. And then they go home at 5, and maybe they'll read at 9, you know? Well, when people are consuming news like that and on their BlackBerries and everything else, the ability of any voice or any sort of this dispassionate arbiter is much harder to compete. It's a much more savage environment as a marketing component. And like I said, it's a very complex subject. I probably have only partially addressed it, and that's the best I can do. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. If memory serves, you're also an Imus favorite.
Yes, I've been on Don's show many times.
That's a plus. No, I wanted to ask you about the president's trip to Asia. Mm-hmm. It's a big deal. Mm-hmm. And part of the big deal is the trade agreement that's in the works.
Yep.
There's been little reported about it. There's not a lot of information available. But that in itself is a big deal and may be the primary reason for him being there.
One of the biggest reasons, yes.
I wonder if you would be kind enough to elaborate and help us a little bit with the impact of what this is going to mean to the country.
Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement is what it's called. And it is imagined to be, across Asia and the United States, and some additional regional trading partners, a kind of NAFTA between the United States and Asia, lowering tariffs, regularizing trade agreements, and in theory, incentivizing greater and more easily transacted trade with nations we don't have those kind of agreements with yet, and make it a binding thing outside of the World Trade Organization. Okay? The dominant force in global trade in the last 5 years, and this is a vastly undercovered story, and look, if I pitched this to the evening news, I would just be greeted with enormous laughter, you know. I want to do a story on the global trade implications of not using the World Trade Organization but using these sub-regional trade agreements. Okay, yeah. Maybe I'll write about that in National Journal. And I have, actually. What I mean is, in the 90s and the early part of 2000, trade was supposed to be adjudicated, and disagreements among nations over trade either imbalances or trade cheating, meaning dumping goods on a certain market to gain a competitive advantage in violation of an existing trade agreement, was supposed to be dealt with by the World Trade Organization. Nations found that process to be cumbersome, lengthy, and dissatisfying. The World Trade Organization still exists, but the latest round to negotiate that architecture and its ability to enforce and adjudicate these trade disputes has now been going on for like 9 years. Basically, the WTO has vanished as an authority to deal with trade disputes on the global stage. And what has taken its place are regional trade agreements negotiated either nation to nation, very rare, or region to region. Okay? Europe and the European Union has already negotiated an Asia free trade pact. That's why we're trying to get in the game, because the European Union has already beaten us to the punch and has regularized trade rules and a whole set of rules of the road for its trade with Asia. And America's sort of behind the curve there and is trying to jump back in the game. So it's this movement toward regional trade deals that are completely outside the WTO. You don't even take the disagreements to them anymore. You just work on it yourselves, and you have your own deal, just like NAFTA. NAFTA's not adjudicated by the WTO. NAFTA's adjudicated by us, Canada, United States, and Mexico. And we all look at all the rules and regulations. You may take it to the WTO if you're really aggrieved, but that process, again, is slow and people don't like to deal with it. So this movement has been to sort of carve up the globe in a regional way and try to find interests that coincide. All the same questions about NAFTA will be visited upon the Trans-Pacific Trade Alliance. Are the labor regulations sufficient? And in Asia, that's a huge question. What's the minimum wage? What are the working hours? What are the conditions for child labor? What are all those underlying, what are the environmental aspects of it? All that stuff is being negotiated and worked on, and they're getting closer to it, but they want to have regular conversations about it. And one of the places you do this is at an event like ASEAN or the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. I will tell you, we're scheduled to be in Brunei on Monday or Tuesday, and I don't know if this is on any of your vacation planning list, Brunei. I would scratch it if it is. There are probably less hospitable places in the world to travel, but Brunei would be close. But I was there with President Clinton in 2000 before we went on to Vietnam for his historic first visit as American president post-Vietnam War to Vietnam, which is an amazing trip I'll never forget. But we were in Brunei, and I would say the only really interesting thing about Brunei is it has this phenomenal golf course with lights that they shine all night long. It's a 24-hour-a-day golf course. Bill Clinton played golf there. While he played golf with the trade ambassador from Indonesia. On the golf course, they finalized a trade pact between the United States and Indonesia in Brunei, playing golf at like 2 in the morning. I mean, that is like a classically Bill Clinton story on so many different levels. That's probably the only thing I can tell you that Brunei has ever significantly provided to the United States, or Indonesia for that matter. So those things can happen on trips like this, and trade will be an enormously important part. And for the Japanese economy that is trying to move itself out of basically 2 decades of malaise, this is a very big deal. It's a very big deal for South Korea, and it's a way for the United States to have regional trade partners that collectively can assert some economic counterbalance to China. And that's why it's a big deal for the United States. Yes. Oh, thank you.
So, given your given your history in political reporting, does it ever feel like you're less of a citizen affected by policies and things happening in the world, current events, and more like it's just part of a job, like something happening affecting how you work? Sure.
I mean, that component of my job is something I learned very early on. You know, there's no placards. I vote. That's what I do. But I can't involve myself emotionally in any of these issues. I just can't. And I gave that up when I became a reporter, especially when covering politics. But even when I was a cop reporter in Amarillo, Texas, in Las Vegas, and Houston, long before I got to Washington, I cut my teeth as a cop reporter. I would follow the news. I was very interested in politics. I read about it voraciously. But I always told myself, you cannot have a personal dog in this hunt. You just can't. And that's one of the things you give up as a reporter. You just have to get out of the game. Now, the gentleman here might say, wait a minute, haven't a lot of you guys like gone into the biz? You know, didn't the State Department under John Kerry just hire 3 huge journalists? One from the Boston Globe, Glenn Johnson, one Doug France, who used to work at the LA Times. Yes, that happens. And my personal opinion is they give up their journalist card forever. They should never come back. Now, they do come back. I would never come back because I'll never cross that line. And there's a very simple reason why I'll never cross that line. Because in politics, as it should be, the conversation goes something like this. That's a very interesting point, Major. Fascinating. Really great facts. Excellent analysis. Now shut up and do what I tell you because I was on the ballot and I won and you're not. Now, a lot of people can live with that conversation. God bless them. I can't. You know, so I'll never be involved in politics because I can't handle that conversation. And I'm not saying it's an illegitimate conversation. Actually, Lou knows that's a very important conversation. The decider has to decide, whoever it is, a congressman, a mayor, a county councilman, whatever. I was on the ballot. I won. It's my decision. Fine. That linear relationship to decision and advice, a lot of people can live with. I can't. One of the reasons I'm in journalism is I'm accountable, relentlessly accountable. And any of you who follow me on Twitter, you know if I make a mistake, I instantaneously correct it on Twitter in real time. Because I'm relentlessly accountable. That's one of the things I love about my job. But I'm a citizen, but I'm not a citizen in all the aspects that you are citizens, because I can't get involved. I have to just stay out of that, and that's either a sacrifice or a commitment. I never served in the military, but I do think about my job, and always have. The reason I didn't serve in the military is I sort of fell between all the conflicts, age-wise. But I do see my job as public service in that respect that I am not active in the political debate, but I try to help people sort it out. Yeah.
Would you give a perspective, your opinion on the relationship between Putin now and Barack Obama and the red line in Syria and how that's going to play out?
Sure. the relationship between Vladimir Putin and the President Obama and the red line in Syria and how that will play out. I have 3 columns that I've written at National Journal, so you can find those to get my sense of things as they were happening. Putin is a very important and muscular and effective player on the world stage. That just, whether you agree or disagree with him, you just cannot ignore that. Now, there are many things I find repellent about his vision for Russia and the muscularity of his vision for Russia, but Russians like it. And well, let me rephrase that. Enough of a majority of Russians like it. They may find that all the things about rebuilding or reimagining Mother Russia and the centrality of Russia and its great nationalist inclinations also must come with things that are very repressive. Anti-homosexual laws, repression of dissent, a democratic process that is democratic in name only, and enshrines and institutionalizes intense authoritarian power in his hands. All those things are true about modern Russia. But he has no rivals. And those that he sees on the horizon, he works very aggressively, either through prosecution or other means, to silence. And it's a very bad thing, all right? He is, in many ways, according to our values, an illegitimate world player. And now he's the chief arbiter of what we will or will not accomplish in Syria. One of the biggest risks, I think, that's involved with the Syria chemical weapons agreement is that the 2 people who are most important to seeing it being realized, we have no basis to trust. We have no basis to trust Putin, and we have no basis to trust Assad. I mean, Assad, and I wrote this in my column 3 weeks ago, is now the quartermaster. For those of you in the military, you know exactly what I mean. For those of you not, that's one who's in charge of supplies, who says what we do and what we don't have, okay? The quartermaster of what we do and we don't have, we, meaning Syria, if I can be Assad for a second, is Assad. So he's the one who gets to tell the world what he has. Does he have a genuine, legitimate incentive to disclose everything about his chemical weapon stockpiles, information only he possesses? Well, as a rational actor, you would have to say no. You would keep some in reserve. Why? Just in case. Because you're in a dangerous neighborhood. Chemical weapons have been useful for you in the past. They were useful to your father. You're an Alawite minority with a Shia majority in the south and a general relationship with Syrian Christians, but is always up for grabs because you've been living through 2.5 years of civil war. Wouldn't you keep just a little bit in reserve and not tell the world exactly? Well, he's the quartermaster. We have to rely on his honesty and good offices. And then we also have to rely on Putin to say, yes, that's absolutely right. That's all he has. And Putin's incentives are aligned with Syria. They're not aligned with us. All right? And what Putin knows about the president, and I wrote about this, is the president has a huge priority for non-proliferation. He thinks it's a huge strategic interest of the United States to minimize and reduce weapons of mass destruction, nuclear and chemical. A lot of people agree with that. They think it's a really great thing. I think what Putin has figured out is that pursuit and that agenda item for the president is so high that he can induce the president to negotiate something in which he plays a significant role and Assad still plays a significant role. And just ask yourself, if there's noncompliance from the Syrians, are we going to bomb now? I mean, do you really think, after the United Nations has sanctified this process, and we've agreed to a resolution that only says consequences, that specifically does not include military consequences because we negotiated that out at the Russians' behest, that after this negotiating process and Assad throwing his hands up and saying, no, I'm complying, I don't know what this disagreement is, that we're going to bomb then? He's counting on we won't. Putin is counting on we won't. And so I think application of this deal on the Syria chemical weapons thing is going to be very problematic. And it's those granular details that do not create passion in this country. They don't create a lot of headlines, but they buy time for Russia and they buy time for Assad. And both of them are in the buying time business. So I think these are all aspects of that question. And I think Putin understood all of those things going in. He wasn't sure if Obama was going to bomb or not. He thought there was some probability or some possibility of it, and so he throws out this deal, and the president grabbed onto it. And so now that he's grabbed onto it and has taken military action sanctified by the UN off the table, it's now buying time and negotiating details. And I think Assad and Putin both believe buying time and negotiating details favors them much more than the U.S. Yeah.
Hi.
My name is Megan Gill. I'm a senior communication major. And first, on behalf of the students in the Institute, we'd like to thank you for being here with us today. We appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure.
So as an aspiring journalist, and just for all of us here in the room that don't get that firsthand experience, could you describe what the atmosphere is like in a presidential press conference and that dynamic between the staffers and the reporters and how that all works?
Sure. The question was, what's the dynamic like at presidential press conferences? And it's evolved over the years. Those of you old enough to remember when Richard Nixon or Gerald Ford or President Reagan, even George Herbert Walker Bush had them, reporters would raise all their hands and sort of bark simultaneously. We've become much more docile now, and I don't know why. It's sort of a groupthink thing, and once it takes hold, it's hard to change. I'm not actually that comfortable with it. I wish we weren't so docile and sort of called on in a kind of a formal, schoolish, you know, proctor to student sort of thing. But anyway, that's the dynamic now. So you wait to be called on. Sometimes you will know if you're going to get a question. Sometimes you won't. Now, a question inevitably, well, do you tell the White House what you're going to ask? Never. Never, 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 never. Under no circumstance would any reporter, under any circumstance, tell the White House what they were going to ask. Now, the White House tries to guess all the time. They go through a huge process of trying to figure out what's the range of the 10 or 12 questions that are likely to be asked. And oftentimes the president will call on somebody because he knows they have a particular question that they might be more likely to ask. For example, there was a press conference right after the president curtailed part of the NATO summit in Chicago, and he called on a Chicago reporter because he knew the Chicago reporter, because it was a huge issue in Chicago, was going to ask about that, and he wanted to be able to get that on the record. So sometimes there's that dynamic. The most important dynamic for me as a reporter covering the White House, and this is my belief every day I come to work, I should have 6 questions I'm ready to ask the president every minute of every day, because there could be a press conference any minute. And I have colleagues who don't subscribe to this particular point of view, and they get so huffy if there's only an hour notice that there's going to be a presidential press conference. I'm like, what do you mean? You need an hour? Who do you cover? You cover the president. You got to be ready every second, because if he says, hey, what's your question, you damn well better be ready. And in a presidential press conference, you have to be ready with multiple questions, because guess what? If you're asked, if you have the 7th question, well, probably the first 6 were ones you had too, and you've been crossing them off your list. Let me give you a classic example of this. So we were in St. Petersburg, Russia at the G20. The president had a summation press conference. It was right after he had his 20-minute pull-aside with Vladimir Putin. We didn't know how important that pull-aside was. A pull-aside, that's nomenclature, I'm sorry. That's just a meeting off to the side. It's not a formal bilateral meeting. It doesn't have staff and all this stuff. It's just a quick little meeting of the 2 principals. So they had this 20-minute meeting, and then the president was taking questions. There were 9 questions asked at that press conference. I got the 8th. Okay? Well, a lot of the ground had been covered by the time I was called on. All right? So but 7 questions in, you better have something. And so I was crossing them off. Okay, okay, okay. And the one question I had left was, all right, Mr. President, you've been here for 2 days. Do you leave here with any new ideas or new concepts about how the confrontation with Syria, because it was very hot then, might be resolved short of military action? Now, I didn't know what happened with Putin, okay? But what I knew was that hadn't been asked yet. Everyone had been asking about when are you going to strike and when are you going to do it and how's it going to look like and all this other stuff. And so I thought, all right, I need to shift that completely. I need to turn that upside down and ask him, you meet with all these world leaders, a lot of them don't want you to bomb. Do you leave here with anything that might be new or a way out of this or an off-ramp? And the president gave a very artful, kind of circuitous answer, basically saying, no, I haven't really heard anything. Gets on Air Force One, he comes back to his and said, why did Major ask me that question? What, does he know something? I wish I could take credit. I really wish I could say, oh yeah, I've got this little, I've hacked into NSA and I know all the I've got it all. No, I don't. I just knew intuitively that that was the only ground that hadn't been covered. And if that hadn't been asked on this big world stage, then the world would be missing something from the president, who at the time looked like he was on the verge of acting in a very strong military way. And I wanted to have him on the record. Is there anything you've learned here that could take that prospect, if not off the table, shift it for a while and talk about something else? Well, point of fact, come 2 days later, we're in the middle of negotiations about how to get rid of the chemical weapons because Putin has created this opening. Now, the president didn't say that. He didn't tip his hand, but at least I was on to something. Not because I was really smart, but because by process of elimination, that's all that was left. So sometimes that's a dynamic in a presidential news conference. Your network thinks you're brilliant, and you're just lucky. Sometimes it's okay to be lucky.
Hi, how are you? Neil
Very
says
good.
we have time for one last question. So
Oh,
this is
okay.
the last question.
All right.
My name is Lindsay, and I'm a senior politics major here. And my question for you is, what is the most challenging thing that you've ever had to ask a president in a press conference?
You know, I don't really think about it that way in the sense of the most challenging. Because I've always believed that's the fundamental part of my job covering a president, is to ask challenging questions. I can tell you a quick story about the question that I know most upset President Obama. I was with Fox at the time, and there was always, you may remember, this very large conflict structurally between the White House and Fox. I never had that with the president. The president and I respect each other professionally. We've never had crosswords. Matter of fact, when I left the beat, when I left Fox to go to National Journal, he invited my wife and my family to the Oval Office just to say goodbye. He was very gracious. But the president has a temper like everyone in life, and this was right after the incipient but eventually crushed Green Revolution in Iran. And the president had said a lot of very neutral, sort of slightly complimentary things about the revolution, but was sort of trying to stay out of it. And I understood for geopolitical reasons why the White House decided to do that. They thought, looking at all the various options, if the United States immediately threw itself in on behalf of those who were protesting in the streets, the Iranian authorities might see it as the protesters a tool of the U.S., crack down on them more severely, and that would delegitimize this revolution in Iran on the streets if it was thought to be in any way related to America because of our long history in Iran. So there were others who thought the administration should have been much more aggressive on behalf of those in the streets who were dying and getting beat up. But the White House wasn't. They were very cautious for several weeks. The president comes to the briefing room and he has this very aggressive statement condemning the Iranian government and standing foursquare with those in the streets. And unusually that day, the president did not call on the Associated Press or the wires or a bigger network. Fox was certainly not the leading network, and certainly not in the eyes of the Obama White House. But he calls on me first. Again, that's a moment where you've got to be ready. Now, under almost every other circumstance I've ever been in with President Clinton, President Bush, I was never, ever called on first. But again, you've got to be ready. Major Garrett. I said, Mr. President, I read back what he said, the toughest language he had against Iran, and I just looked up, I said, what took you so long? And he was so pissed off. And he like looks at me like because I thought that was the natural question. So and I actually thought there was an answer. Well, I wanted to wait. I didn't want the United States to jump in on this. I thought there wasn't, because I knew what the policy debate was internally. But he was just so angry at me for having this sort of temerity to suggest he was late to the rhetoric and late to the table. He gives a long answer, very forceful, and first of all, I don't know what you're talking about, and I've always said, and it actually worked to his disadvantage because he said, I've always been here. Well, no, he hadn't. It wasn't even close to where he had been. And actually the policy answer, which I knew was underlying this shift, would have been a much better answer, but he didn't give it. All right, fast forward 2 months. We're in Russia. And the president's doing the 5 network interviews. And I'm with Fox, so I'm the last of 5. It was the day that Michael Jackson died. And I will tell you that I will always consider it a small badge of honor that of the 5 correspondents who interviewed the president that day in Moscow, I was the only one who didn't ask him his reaction to Michael Jackson's death. But we sit down, okay? I sit down and I look up and the president said, so, what took you so long? Would you work on that for hours? And it was what we would say in baseball. I played baseball for 12 years as a kid growing up in San Diego. That was some chin music. That was a fastball right under my chin, like meant to get me to back off. And I'm like, you seriously can't be angry about that. So yeah, well, we'll see. You know, and then the interview went on. So that was one of the very few times where the president let me know that every politician has memory, Lou. They all have memories. That's the first time I knew that the memory was long-lasting and that we were going to adjudicate this right then and there before the next interview started. So I wouldn't even say that was my most challenging question. It was a challenging question, but I know that's the one that's gotten the most memorable presidential reaction. So you've been a fantastic audience. Thank you so much for having me here, and I hope to see you all again soon.